All right, my name is Peter Mikitsh. I'm a software engineer at Intuit, and I work on our players team. And we use React and React Native quite extensively to render the TurboTax experience. Today I'll be discussing Redux, which is a state management tool. It can be used with React, React Native, Angular, any front-end technology that you like to use. So the concepts of Redux are pretty abstract in that regard. It's got a 2 kilobyte bundle size. So if you're like me and you're worried about your bundle size for your single page application, maybe you have a lot of dependencies. You don't want your app to take too long to load over the air. Sure. Thanks. So as I was saying, Redux has a 2 kilobyte bundle size. So if you're worried about the size of your application, don't fret when you're using Redux, because it's a really small library and it packs a lot of functionality in those 2 kilobytes. So there's 3 concepts you have to get down when you're using Redux: actions, reducers, and state. So all of your application state is just stored in a plain old JavaScript object. And for the purposes of this talk, we'll just have a little to-dos app that we have. So our application state is pretty simple here. So we have a plain old JavaScript object with the to-dos property, which is just an array of to-dos objects. And you can see that each of those objects has a text property. Okay, so we have a plain old JavaScript object, that's our state, and that's what we're going to use to render our UI. To-dos object is just an array. And that's our state. And let's go into actions. So actions, again, just a plain old JavaScript object. They take 2 properties. Usually I see these structured as having a type and a value. The type would be the action you're going to perform on your state. And then the value is going to contain the information that's going to be injected into the new state. So we have our action. It's going to run through a reducer function. And our reducer function takes that action object and our existing state, and it's going to return the new state of the Redux store. So in the case of adding our new to-do item, going to the swimming pool, we would expect to have our 2 existing objects, our eat food and our exercise to-do tasks, and we just want to append that new to-do item on there. Reducers are the most complex feature of Redux, because they kind of tie everything together. You can think of them as the glue between your action and your state. So as I was saying before, given your old state and your action, you're going to feed these properties into your reducer function, and you're going to get a new state output. So looking at our reducer implementation here, you can see that by default, we set the state parameter to just an empty array. You usually do 1 reducer function for each property in your global Redux store. So if I had something in addition to to-dos, I would write another reducer function to process those actions. So our initial state is just, again, an empty list, but we'll be passing in this to-dos array with 2 items and our actions object. And the way most of these reducers functions are usually set up is they're just a switch statement. You process all of your cases, and by default, you want to return your existing unmutated state. So in the case of adding our new to-do, we take our existing list and just concatenate a new to-do object. And all of that information is included inside of the action object. So in the case of passing in our go-to swimming pool value here, we just set that as the text, and by default, we're not going to mark these as complete. So if we pass in these 2 parameters to this reducer, this will be our new state output. We'll have our new object go to swimming pool, and our default value will be false for completed. And then we're going to take that data and immediately render a new screen in React. And that's the great thing about the React Redux integration is you don't have to write any code to do that. Anytime your state changes, it's going to automatically update for you. So here we can see our new go-to swimming pool in our UI. In terms of actually writing the integration code, the first 20 lines in my example here are all existing React. So if you know React, that'll be really straightforward. All you have to do is write 1 function and wrap your component in a higher order component from React Redux. So you want to import the named export connect from React Redux. and you're going to connect that to a function you write called mapState to props, and pass in your existing component that'll render what we have over here. So we'll take our global state, and we want to just cherry pick from our global Redux state what we need. If we're passing in state to this component that we don't need, anytime React calls should component update, it's going to be inspecting those props. And if it has to do a shallow or deep comparison, that could be a serious performance hit. So you only want to cherry pick what you need off of your global Redux state and attach it to this specific component. So in the context of our to-dos list, we just want our to-dos data. If we had any other data in our Redux store, we are explicitly not passing that in this function that we're returning a new object. And all of the properties in this object will be passed in as props to our React component. So I'm returning a to-do list property in the object, and you'll see that we declare the prop to-do list to be an array. And the syntax I'm using here for the React component, if you're not familiar, it's stateless functional syntax. So you can just write a function rather than if you're using ES6 and you're extending React component. But if you don't have any state and you just have props, you can just declare it as a simple function. So it's a little syntactic sugar, but it's just a regular plain old React component where you returned what you'd have in your render function. So we want to take our to-do list array and just map it. And I have this wrapped in divs here. I'll have an input checkbox representing the complete or incomplete state of my to-do. And next to it, I'll render my to-do text. So eat food, exercise, go to swimming pool. In terms of using Redux in a production application, you're probably going to be using it to get remote data from an API. I know the example I had here was pretty contrived. But it's really great if you have a lot of components that might share the same data and you don't want to have to keep writing boilerplate code to go fetch that data from your API and put it in your component state. So you only have to do that once. Also, it prevents you from having to write deeply chaining your props if you have a complicated component architecture and you keep passing your props down. That would be your API data. You don't have to, you can resolve yourself from having to do that by just wrapping each one of your React components in that higher order connect function that React Redux provides. Additionally, I've used Immutable.js with my stores. Immutable.js is a library by Facebook. So it makes your object comparisons a lot faster. That way, when you are evaluating if your components need to repaint on the screen, you can just do a shallow comparison, and it'll make your performance much better if you have a really complicated tree. So if your application grows, well, I'd recommend just starting with Immutable.js from scratch. That way you don't have to add it in later. So that's my quick intro on Redux. My email is up there, and I'm also on GitHub, Peter Mikitsh. Do we have any questions on Redux? I'd be happy to take those.
Do you have a rule of thumb for what kind of data goes in component state versus App Store?
Sometimes I will keep inside of component state. If I have, for example, maybe like a UI like collapsible component, maybe I want to know if that's open or closed. I might actually use the React component state for that, whereas any remote data that I'd be getting from an API, I would probably use Redux. Okay. So anything that I wouldn't want to know about in another component, like if I don't need to know about, for example, if this component is closed or open, if it's just something that I don't need to expose globally in the state, I would just keep it inside of that component. But as much as I can, I like to use Redux because I can use that stateless functional syntax. It keeps the components really easy to implement.
Thank you.
Am I on? Yeah. Could you talk about a pattern to persist both to a REST API or some backend store as well as to the Redux store?
Like keeping them in sync if the data were to change?
Correct.
Sure. Actually, what I've done in my application, so I mentioned here for remote data like WebSockets. For example, on my server, I have a framework I like called Feathers.js that I use in my applications. And you can subscribe to events when your data changes. So you can use those socket IO hooks, so you'll get new data when your data changes, and then you can just create new actions to update your store in real time, and then your store changes will propagate through your component tree. So if you had any data, I know if you're using like an HTTP REST API, your data is immediately stale. But if you tie it with WebSockets, if you're creating like a real-time application, I've used the combination of the two, and it works really well with React and Redux.
So is that like when you're saving, or what? How does Feathers tie into the Redux store? Or does it tie in through a thunk, or is it, where? How does it know that your Redux store has changed?
Oh,
so your Redux store.
Sorry. Yeah. So if your server doesn't, if your Redux store, your server-side code, generally speaking, won't know about it. So if you want to change data on the server, what you could do, gosh, how do I do this in my applications? I usually just always am listening to any changes over socket IO. So if I do a REST call to like create a new resource, the socket IO hook will immediately get that after I create it, and then I'll have it traverse through the network. If you wanted to create something, there's a couple ways you could handle this situation. If you had an object you knew you were going to persist and you already had the object in the client side, you could just add it to your Redux store yourself, or you could wait for it to go through the network and wait for it to come back through socket IO. There's different ways to handle it.
So you would update it on the server and it would push it back out to the store?
That's how I've done it.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, if you had some latency issues, it could, maybe if you had a slow network, that maybe might not be the most ideal implementation. Mm-hmm. So it would probably depend on your use case and what you're looking to do.
Okay, that makes sense. I had been looking also at Relay for something that had a lot of back-end interaction, because it kind of takes away that seems like there's kind of a gap with Redux. Something that has a lot of back-end interaction, you have to kind of triangulate that thing. You have to go to the server, it then has to come back to your store, so that your store is then up to date for your front end, right?
Yeah, it can be tricky to keep your store in sync with your server-side data.
So Relay kind of does a good job of keeping your React components up to date constantly, but that's a trade-off. So
yeah, for sure. Any other questions? All right, I think we're good with the questions. Well, thank you very much, guys.